Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I am not even sure what webinar this is in our series of webinars. So for those of you who have joined us before, we're doing a series, or haven't joined us before, we're doing a series of webinars on the different indicators in the monitoring framework. These have been worked on by an ad tag on indicators that was established to develop the methodologies for specific headline indicators in the monitoring framework. And so we're trying to go into detail to explain what those indicators look like, how they would be measured. And for the indicators that we're talking about today, there was a technical expert group on financial reporting, which was established. And then this group was established to work specifically on the finance indicators. So these are the indicators related to goal D, target 18, and target 19. The co-chairs of that group were Lucrecia Landman of Switzerland and Juan Pinto of Colombia. So they're going to be providing the major presentations today on the finance indicators. And then this technical expert group reported to the ATEC. And so the ATEC has then compiled the results in order to present them in a consistent way, but the work itself was done by the TEG. And so with that, I'll hand over to my colleague Marcus, who leads our work on finance at the Secretariat, and he's the one that worked directly with the TEG on this. Over to you, Marcus.
Yes, thank you, Jillian, and good time of the day to everyone, and special welcome, of course, to the two co-chairs of the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting. They met twice last fall in Montreal, and then this spring in Istanbul, Turkey. That was kindly hosted by the Biofin initiative. And they also had a lot of intersessional work because the group established subgroups to work on the individual headline indicators, a total of 5. But we are going to hear from Lucrecia and Juan, who will join momentarily on the details and on the outcome of their work. As Jillian mentioned, this work of the TAG was then subsequently integrated by the ATEC on indicators into the overall work on the entire monitoring framework. And the document that is a relevant Subster document that brings that together is now basically is available for consideration by Subster. Now, one thing I wanted to mention, and we are going to mention that, of course, also during Subster when the document will be introduced, there is unfortunately, specifically on the finance indicators or finance-related indicators, there is a couple of small editing glitches. So if you look at the Annex 1 of the Subster document, there is under target 18 a list of complementary indicators that came from the earlier version. And that was basically used as a basis for the development of the disaggregation that you also see in this table. But that means that that earlier list of the complementary indicators should now be deleted. They were accidentally retained from the earlier document, the COP 15.5 document. Additionally, there is also, if you look at the headline indicator itself, the tag proposed to the ATEC, and the ATEC accepted a deletion of some words in the headline indicators. Lucrecia and Juan might want to explain why, but this deletion was incomplete. So there is this hanging text that still says "our reform," etc. That should be deleted. So this yeah. Okay, and then there is also an error in Annex 2 of the Subster document, where simply the organizations for indicator 18 for target 18.1 and target 18.2 were reversed. So meaning the text for 18.2 should be what is shown for 18.1. And the last thing I wanted to quickly mention before handing over to Lucrecia, that I wanted to mention that there is also now a notification, 2024-33, then went out to invited comments on the metadata fact sheets that are provided in information document 14 with a deadline of 3rd of May. Now, the metadata document provides the guidance on how the indicators will be implemented. So the participants, including you, I mean the participants in this webinar today, might want to also submit your views if you have any. So that's not a correction, but I thought might still be worth bringing that to your attention. So with that, one last thing worthwhile mentioning is specifically on indicator D3 for private funding on biodiversity, both national, international, and domestic. That headline indicator had this famous asterisk indicating that global methodology is not yet available. So there was a particular challenge for the technical expert group. And in order to enable the group to better manage that challenge, we were in a position to hire additional capacity in form of a consultant to do some more in-depth work on what is available, what could be used, etc. So we will hear from her, Christina van Winkle, also basically summarizing her work specifically on indicator D3. So we will hear from the co-chairs first, then from Christina on specifically on her work on indicator D3, and then we will have short questions and answers. With that, and without further ado, let me give the floor to Lucrezia, and welcome, Juan. Good to see you. Of course, I leave it entirely up to you how you want to divide the work. If you have slides, please do that by sharing your screen. I made you already a presenter, Lucrezia, so you should be able to do that. If it's very complicated, we can also share the screen from you from our end.
We can't hear you at all. Yeah, it doesn't even show up that you're muted. It's like you don't have a mic. Maybe Juan, you could say something just so we know that we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think it's because I think you might have to grant access permissions because I had the same thing.
We did do that.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I need to go with headphones. Good. I can share and then Juan will start. Let me just try whether I will indeed be able to do that. Oh my goodness. I don't really want to.
Should be at the top of the screen next to where there's the camera, the mic, and the share button.
Yeah,
You
I'm
want
just
me to
studying.
share?
Okay, this is not ideal. Oh gosh, see, this is not at all. Okay, so are you seeing now the first slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. So everyone, thank you very much for attending this webinar. We are going to deliver the presentation with Lucretia, my co-chair, on the work of the Technical Expert Group on Financial Reporting. Next slide, please. So the scope of the work of the TEG, in summary, our mandate, was to address indicators for the goals and targets that are relevant for resource mobilization, in particular for public expenditures and private investments, and other targets relevant for resource mobilization and monitoring framework. We're also instructed to provide technical advice and guidance on monitoring resource mobilization, recommend a simple, standardized national reporting template or use of an existing reporting system or systems and databases, and advise on existing capacity gaps and needs in terms of capacity development, technology transfer, and financing needs. Thank you. Next slide. So far, what you have in the screen is the progress that we made since the first meeting of the group. So the TEG met twice in Montreal and Istanbul. In those meetings, in the first meeting, we created subgroups to work on each of the 5 indicators because it was deemed the easiest way to tackle some of the problems, and also leveraging the expertise that we had around the table, which was quite considerable. Then the subgroups would meet online, and they would discuss their progress. And then in the two physical meetings, they were after the first meeting, they start to work on the metadata sheets, and they were addressing the indicators to then present them to the TEG as a whole in Istanbul. After the TEG reviewed and finalized the work of the subgroups, we met in person, we discussed, we finished the metadata sheets, and we consider a different, the different sort of nuances that each brought. And we also heard the report of the consultant on, private funding. After that, the two co-chairs of the TEG, Lucretia and myself, we presented, the work of the TEG in Cambridge. It was approved. The vast majority was approved. There was only one part of the work that wasn't approved because it was found to be out of scope. And this is where we are. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is basically the summary of the indicators. We're gonna go, we're not gonna go into each one of them, but at least here you see sort of like the indicators that the TEG sort of discuss and what we developed. So positive incentives, harmful incentives, international public funding, domestic public funding, and private funding, both domestic and international. Next slide, please.
Then I think I'll take over. So we just wanted to briefly speak to that in terms of the overall framework, like where we come in with our work in the context of the monitoring framework. So as we've mentioned, and in the introduction was mentioned by Gillian and by Marcus. So what really our main product as a group was really the metadata sheets that contain the information on in detail on the headline indicators. They include the disaggregation, the definitions. They also speak to the method of computation, or well, the methodology as such, how and where the data is collected, and some other relevant guidance. I'm sure many of you have looked at the INF document that Marcus mentioned in the introduction, where all those metadata sheets for each single headline indicator is part. And but so that's the main sort of also element of the monitoring framework in terms of guidance. But of course, the actual sort of reporting will happen through the online reporting tool, of which I'm sure many of you have heard as well, that is under development. And in that online reporting tool, which I cannot speak in detail, as we've seen it as a group, but of course, nor am I a technical person, nor has it been in our mandate, or would it have been in any case to develop that. Oh, sorry. Do you still see the? Oops. What happened? I seem to be out of the. Hello.
Yeah, we're not seeing your desktop.
We see your desktop now. Yeah, now you're back. Now you're back. Well, you were
now
just
we see
back.
But you don't see the presentation, right? What happened? Oh gosh, that's scary. Okay, sorry. We're back. No.
Yeah, that's good.
You're back.
Apologies about that. So obviously the online reporting tool was not part of our mandate, and as you can see, I'm not a technical person, as I mentioned, but in any case, it's part of through which the parties will report, and in that system then they'll be reporting on the headline indicators by either using the proposed methodologies on which we've worked as a group, and the associated databases will be drawn on. But as parties decided at the COP15, there's always the option also for parties to report their own national data, making transparent the associated methodologies that they use in that online reporting tool in which the parties will report for the national reports, as part of the national reports. So as Juan mentioned, what we thought we would be doing is just speak by way of example to two headline indicators explaining how they look like and basically what our work was. Then of course we are open to questions at the end if you had any to the other headline indicators. So basically I'll use the first one because as you know, we worked on both 18 and 19, or that is 18 and D, the goal D, with those 5 indicators, and the 18.1 is the one that speaks to the positive incentives. It reads, as you've seen before, positive incentives in place to promote biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And it is the disaggregation with which we came up was, as you can read in the right-hand column, basically by type, because very important, what this headline indicator is measuring is the number of incentives. And so it is the number of different types by the disaggregation that you can see here. So it's biodiversity relevant taxes, fees, and charges, then the biodiversity positive subsidies, biodiversity relevant tradable permits, payment for ecosystem service programs, and biodiversity offset schemes. And the methodologies, if you want, that is being proposed or is the methodology and the associated database of the OECD. It's the PINE database. That is an existing database with that precisely collects from many countries, many more than only OECD countries. By now there are 134 countries that report to that PINE database, which collects information on a regular basis from countries, by them self-reporting, using those precise disaggregation or these precise categories that you see here. So that's the methodology as such, if you want, that what we proposed to be used. So as it is an existing database, countries could then, in the online reporting tool, when selecting this the proposed methodology, have the data automatically pulled from the OECD PINE database, but of course always with the option of also modify, or as I mentioned previously, alternatively provide their national data rather than draw on the existing one. So as you can see, we had quite a few some discussions as a group on the fact that, well, the headline indicator, as I said, is measuring the number of incentives. As a group, of course, we've had that was maybe only part of the picture. After all, it is we are speaking of the sort of financial indicators, and so as a group, we propose to have the component indicators also speak to the actual monetary value of the same incentives that we have under the headline indicators. So countries could, as you know, component and complementary indicators are voluntary, but then it's as encouragement for parties to also report the monetary value of the incentives which they will be reporting on under the headline indicator. And I think that's basically just a summary of what I've told you, and happy to go into more details afterwards. And as I said, I'll hand over now to Juan to speak to the other indicator we picked as illustration.
Thank you very much, Lou. So here you have domestic public funding and domestic public funding and conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and ecosystems. This is a monetary, the headline indicator understood as such is a monetary value. We within the process we had conversations about what would be the best way to account for these fundings, try to avoid double counting, and what would be the best way to get the information that we need to know exactly what's going into the national pots, right? Because the complex part of this is trying to figure out in terms of the D indicators was how the flows would cross, right? So to put this in an example, imagine the Ghostbusters, the movie. Remember that if you cross the streams, it wouldn't work very well. So you had to separate the streams and then, attack whatever ghost you were trying to attack. It's sort of the same thing here. If you cross streams, then, everything goes to hell. So when we're analyzing our conversations on what was the best way to do it, we realized after analyzing the systems that were out there, capture information systems, gathering data, platforms, classification systems. We went through the whole thing, and we realized that it's still very it's still very nascent, the biodiversity part of all of this, and some are better at sort of accounting for those domestic expenditures that are related to biodiversity versus some that are in catch-all categories that are, for example, this is not climate change, so therefore this has to be in biodiversity and others, or basically you don't have a category. So within our metadata sheet, apart from outlining how the headline indicator looks like, the complementary indicators as you're seeing on the screen, the rationale behind this, we also develop a definitions, concepts, and classification side of it, which allows, for example, in terms of what is a biodiversity expenditure, because one of the things that it's more complicated about this is actually explaining what is a biodiversity expenditure, because it's not so clear that that we all have the same, or the countries have sort of a similar idea across the board. So considering that, we did explain that we put a category based on BioFin's definition of a biodiversity expenditure. Then we also provided sort of like, look, these are the categories we suggest you use when you're trying to fit these expenditures, because in some parties do not have that. Then we went through the classification of environmental purposes SEP. So we explained, okay, this is what it's useful. These are the transactions. This is how, the disaggregation that it's there. So, if you are trying to use that one, then understand that this is how it's divided. The same thing with the classification of function of governments, COFOG. We explained that also in detail. And we also explained some of the subcategories that are relevant for biodiversity expenditures. So, and again, making a big note, which is, there are ways of avoiding double counting. And, we know that some of these sort of methodologies are not perfect, and we're trying to get a hybrid approach where parties, you can give the number that you want, but we're also suggesting another way of getting it, which might make it sort of comparable across, across different countries and allow for a trend analysis. But we understand, countries can decide to use or not these methodologies, but we've given guidance on that, also reminding them about double counting. Then after we move from this, the method of computation, right? So you have different ways of doing it with BioFin, with SEP, with COFOG. We explain exactly in the metadata sheet, okay, if you're doing, if this is how you're going to compute it, take into account the following categories. And that's important. Why? Because, partially you can give a number, but you also, within the reporting tool, you're also going to have to say, okay, look, this is how I'm using to account it. It could be BioFin, the countries that have their BioFin studies, they can sort of update them, have that number and put it in and say, well, we're using BioFin. Great. We know the categories. We know the 9 categories behind that. Or I'm using SEP and I'm using these 2 accounts, 502, protection of biodiversity and landscape, or 503. So we know, okay, this is how the information is divided there, COFOG. So that's what we developed. So after we continue with that, we gave, where you can find these, the explanations of the methodologies, the more sort of in detail sort of parts of this, which I think which we think actually it's fundamental to understand better how these things work and, what you get out of them if you use them versus not. Apart from that, we start to develop, the data compilers. So we have the CBD, we have Eurostat, OECD, IMF, well, IMF for COFOG, Eurostat, and OECD for EPA, and UNDP Biofin. So we sort of provide a list that you can go through and say, oh, okay, this is what's good. So that's in gaps in data coverage. We've studied the gaps of COFOG, the EPA, Biofin, and all these things, and we've outlined them there as a way of showing to countries that it wasn't only an analysis of, okay, what's the easiest way to get the information, but also recognizing that we, that things have to move forward and there has to be a capacity building component of this in order to get the information that we need. This is a start, which is a great start, but we also recognize that there are some limitations to this approach. And by identifying, we hope that countries also, when they relate to their reporting, they can understand, okay, this is the kind of thing that we need to work in the future. This is how we should work on it. And this is what, this is what we want that amount to look like in the substantive part. So with that in mind, I'm not gonna continue to explain in much more detail that indicator. You can understand D1, D3 have a similar structure. The only thing that D3 has that like D2 and D1 doesn't have is that we had to basically start from scratch. And that's where the report of the consultant comes in. And then with that report, we started building, the different categories because we had to account for domestic and international philanthropy. And, like private fund, like private expenditures that are both domestic and international, because they have a different, way of being accounted. So we took that into account and we developed it more. Next slide, please. And, in terms of like a general idea of where you can find guidance on the methodologies, apart from the metadata sheets from all 5 indicators, you have the COP decisions, you have supporting information and documents for the ORT, and then you have supporting organizations that are, that are linked to the ORT and the SOPSTA documents. So you can find a more detailed, analysis of all these questions over there. And of course, the webinar is intended for us to answer, specific questions that you might have on what we've been doing. So I think that with this in mind, unless we have something else, Lucretia, unless you want to say something else, I think we can move to the, to the Q&A part of this. And we really want to thank you for your patience this morning in listening to this. Some parts sound very dry and very technical, but in reality, that's what it is. We tried our best to reflect the multiple conversations that we had within as a group and then at the ATIC. And I think the result of the work is substantive enough that allows to account for these flows in these different ways and actually have a tool that is worthy to build upon. So thank you.
Thank you to both of you. And from my perspective, I have to add, I would to just echo what you said. I mean, it was intense technical work in the group, and it was quite fascinating. I mean, some of these technical aspects, very wonkish indeed, but also very interesting from an intellectual perspective. Now, hearing your presentation, I think one could roughly say that the technical complexities associated with the indicators increase in their number, right? And the indicators on 18.1, 18.2 were pretty, I wouldn't say easy. There's a lot of, technical intricacies, but we have established methodologies, we have established databases, etc. And then as we moved to the domestic, well, we have a plethora of different approaches. We do not have a one-go shop, etc. And then it becomes even more complex with D3, where, as you said, we basically had to start from scratch. So before moving to the question and answers, let's hear from Christina on the input she provided to the group. Yeah, Christina, you can start.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to pull up one slide I put together as a visual. Hopefully this isn't too busy for the group. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, you just need to, yeah, now it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Thank you very much, Marcus. And I'm just going to build a little bit on what Lucretia and Juan have already discussed in terms of all of these resource mobilization targets across 18 and 19. Just to add some additional context to headline indicator D3, this is specifically looking at private funding, both domestic and international, on conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity ecosystems. As Juan mentioned, the technical expert group was really starting from scratch on this one, which was much further behind than the other indicators. So I was brought on to support the technical expert group and to provide some guidance on how we can identify approaches that will support this D3 headline indicator. And I did that through a desk review and through in-depth interviews with a number of experts, and I was able to find some global estimates and some regional and national estimates that I could identify. How are they quantifying private expenditures, and what data sources and methodologies are they using, and what can be extracted that then can be used for the metadata fact sheets that guide parties in their reporting against this indicator. What I found across the studies is there's really a lot of overlap in the approaches and the methods that are used. Looking globally, the global estimates are that private finance accounts for about 10 to 15% of total biodiversity related funding, anywhere from 10 to 35 billion a year. And I've shown it by these different funding mechanisms or funding channels that we found the private finance for biodiversity is really channeled through. And you can see here a significant amount of private funding is really flowing through biodiversity offsets. This is largely in jurisdictions that have regulatory frameworks for biodiversity offsets. Sustainable commodities, this is looking at forestry and agricultural goods and services, palm oil, coffee, tea, and then and also through impact investing, through debt and equity securities that are even more challenging to track. But what I did find is that there's no one data source that captures the myriad of ways that private finance flows to biodiversity. So the work here is really proposing a disaggregation of this headline indicator that can then dive into specific approaches or data sources where they're available to support capturing private funding for biodiversity. And so the table on the right is really looking at how we can disaggregate these various flows and what data and data and approaches are available. And you'll see, for some of the international private philanthropy, some private finance mobilized through development finance. There is the OECD creditor reporting system that countries can draw on. Lucrezia mentioned the PINE, the Policy Instruments for Environment database. They do capture private expenditures for offsets and payments for ecosystem services, although it's limited in the reporting under that database. And so then I think, what we realize is that we really need to provide countries with a flexible menu of options approach to meet the varying national circumstances and data availability. And so the metadata fact sheet really proposes certain data sets that they can draw on, but also provides guidance for countries to collect their own information, whether that's through public information that they have or surveys that they can distribute. I think this will be particularly important for the domestic funding, both for private donations and for impact investing, having to capture that information kind of from the bottom up because there's not really relevant available data that can be disaggregated to the national level. And then proposing some alternative approaches for countries that have implemented national statistical accounts, that have environmental protection activity accounts that they can draw on, particularly for domestic funding. And also there was mentioned BioFin. BioFin's expenditure review methodology allows for the collection of private expenditures. Where that's available, countries can draw from that. And then finally, recognizing that there really is a lack of a universal definition for biodiversity or for nature positive investments, the work proposed a complementary indicator to determine whether parties have developed or begun to develop a sustainable finance taxonomy. These classification systems can provide a clear and consistent definition of what's considered beneficial to biodiversity, and it would allow financial institutions, investors, and policymakers to better compare investments and track financial flows more efficiently. And so this, like I said, was presented to the technical expert group in Istanbul and then fed into the metadata fact sheet that was provided and that has since been adopted by the ACTAG. So I think I will leave it there and I will pass it back off to Marcus.
Thanks, Christina. And just to add that your complete report will of course be also made available as an information note to Subster. So perhaps let's move on to some more interactive format after hearing these useful presentations. I saw that we so far had one question which was more related on the flow, but I think that could be transformed into a request to perhaps add a few words, and I guess it would go to you, Lucrezia, on indicator 18.2. That is the one talking about harmful incentives.
Oh, I'm not muted. Sure. Yes, if I can speak to that. As you know, it is about measuring the decrease and the reduction of harmful incentives for biodiversity as reflected in the target 18. And so that was how originally the indicator read. It spoke of the value of subsidies and other harmful incentives harmful to biodiversity that have been reformed, phased out or eliminated as it reached in the target. However, from a methodological point of view, as a group, we quickly came to the conclusion that it was not feasible to measure, nor would it be actually purposeful if that was the way of how to report on that indicator and actually measuring what we want to achieve, namely reducing those by 500 billion until 2030. So because and basically, if we measured harmful incentives, what would happen is that you could report on those incentives reduced, eliminated, phased out or eliminated, but at the same time, of course, introduce new harmful incentives. And so the impact and the for biodiversity would obviously be even worse, and we would not have accounted for, and we would not have what we really want to know. That's the the volume of negative incentive having gone down. So basically, we reformulated the headline indicator slightly, and it's just reads now value of subsidies and other incentives harmful to biodiversity. And so with the idea that countries will be reporting on that, starting with data from 2020, and over time by establishing a time series, we could hopefully observe that positive trend that we need to see to reach the goal, or I should say the target, those 500 billions. That was sort of the first big step that we did as ATEC, and eliminating some words from the headline indicator. And then when it comes to actual methodologies of how you could account for it, we again turn to the to established methodologies and databases at the OECD, which do capture the bulk of harmful incentives to biodiversity, and so these are also in the metadata sheet listed under the disaggregation. And basically, there were three methodologies and categories with the associated database that we found and we list there. And then, of course, there is a third one which countries can report, a fourth one, which countries can report on any other ones. The three are basically the agricultural subsidies that are potentially harmful to the biodiversity. There the second category is the value of subsidies to capture fisheries with risk or moderate or high of encouraging unsustainable fishing. And then as the last one is the value of government fossil fuel subsidies, the production consumption. I must also add and correct in a way what I said before, because actually the first two ones are associated to the basis and the methodologies at the OECD, but the third one, I'm sure you'll recognize it, is actually an SDG, the 12C SDG indicator. So that's then also where we look for when it comes to methodology and the database, no? Because countries report under their SDG reporting on government fossil fuel subsidies. So these are the three disaggregation, the three categories, and the three methodology and databases that would capture the bulk of harmful incentives and are proposed. I think that's sort of in a very nutshell what 18.2 contains. And so I'll leave it at that, but happy to answer further questions if there are any.
Yeah, thanks, Lucrezia. And I don't see any further questions in the chat or in the question and answers. So I ask everyone, if you want to raise issues, please do so now. I see a question from Ritsuko. Why don't you just take the floor?
Right. Thank you, co-chairs, for the explanation. And I'm Ritsuko Yoneda from Japanese Ministry of Agriculture. I was the leading negotiator for the Target 18 at the ICMI Montreal, and also responsible for the OECD 2 indicators of agriculture and fisheries. I actually wondering why in the expert group did not take into consideration of the OECD identification methodology, which was clearly articulated in the COP15 decision 7 of the resource mobilization. It was a kind of checklist methodology and with a chart how to identify harmful methodologies, harmful subsidies for the each countries, and that was a really useful information, and it should be considered, but it's not appeared in the information document. So I really wanted to know about why that was not considered in the work by the experts group. And also now I would like to note that the usefulness and the validity of using two OECD indicators were intensively discussed during the OEWG beforehand, and the conclusion of the delegation was it was not appropriate to use the as a the headline indicator, and that's why it was categorized as the complementary indicator. So, and I'm gonna stop in the country which prefer to use the complementary indicator as a headline reporting. But I really would like to mention that, and noting that there was a big discussion before OEWG 203 or 5. And thank you for ISP here. Thank you.
Sure, I can react to that. So of course we worked very much on the basis of the decisions of the COP 15, and that's why in the beginning of our presentation it was very important for us to once again highlight the fact that, again, coming from the decision in Montreal, countries of course always have the option of reporting national data on their headline indicators. So it's in their national reporting, they have it is absolutely up to the country to decide with what methodology what data in the end they report. So that's very important, I think, to highlight. So even if what is proposed as a methodology to basically simplify, harmonize, making more comparable, maybe also national reports, is an option in a way, no? And basically, we were tasked with putting some flesh to that headline indicator. So we needed to come up with a number and that would come from somewhere, or that countries could draw on. And so, I mean, we felt that precisely because it was reflected in the decision, as you know, in the decision 5, as a source, it was a valid source to elaborate on, given that it is an established methodologies and it has an existing database which could again allow countries, if they wish so, to draw on and pre-populate, you know, the online reporting tool with that number. Even if they choose to do that, then they are still, you know, free to modify that number if they don't feel comfortable with whatever is drawn on from the producer support database as only the harmful incentives. So we as a you know, technical expert group, we really just focused on providing the tools. So I mean, behind the methodology, so the tools for parties to report on. We did not take any stance, and we were very much aware of you know, in what context and the what condition under what conditions parties would be reporting. So I hope that gives some explanation and also some reassurance of you know, our work and what is being proposed now to parties.
Thank you for your answer, and it clarified my concerns a little more. In that case, then what the status of this information document is? Maybe this is a question for the secretariat, not the experts group. But can we expect the revision of the information document or kind of sort of things until COP16? Maybe that's the purpose. We are expected to make a submission to the secretariat.
Jillian, you want to respond?
Yeah, I'll come on, and I put this in the chat, but I think now that it's kind of getting lost. But if you look at notification 33, so 2433, then you can see that actually for the information document, it's open for submission of views. So what SAPSTA decided was that when we publish the metadata, that we would also invite views. And so the expectation is that this information document will not be formally negotiated because it's a very technical methodological document, but it is open for submission of views. You could then submit your comments, and we will see how this goes, but my expectation would be that the Secretariat then would make revisions in order to reflect some of the comments in consultation with the experts that have been involved. And so that would be how I would see this working. But as I said, if you are very welcome to submit views. It's open until May 3rd, so there's not heaps of time because we are trying to get an idea of what these views look like before we go to SAPSTA.
Are there any more comments or questions? Please just raise your hand. Well, if there are none, I think all that remains to me is to say again thank you to the co-chairs for their presentation. Thanks, Christina, and of course thanks to the overall organizer of the webinar series to provide a platform to present on the finance indicators. Jillian, any last words? So with that, I wish you all a good day or good night, good afternoon. And I guess we will see each other, or many of you will see at Subster. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good one.